So I'm going to talk about how to architect your startup on AWS so it's a lean and mean account. And let's talk about why we'd want to do this. Money. And we don't want to burn money. We don't want to waste it. A lot of startups, there'll be opportunity to get credits, and I'll talk about that at the end. And obviously you're on a budget. Either you're doing it bootstrapped or you're doing it with VC capital. It's not finite, or it's a finite amount of money, so you don't want to waste it. So I'm kind of curious, is anybody here doing a startup or involved with a startup? Oh, awesome, awesome. Are you bootstrapped or funded or? Bootstrapped. So is it funded then or? No.
We're a consulting firm that supports startups.
Right. Oh, okay. That makes sense. So that's a whole nother aspect of the whole saving money, why you want to save money. So these are really good reasons, especially bootstrapped. I prefer bootstrapped because it allows you to kind of do things on your own time frame rather than be pushed into doing something you might not want to do. So I'm going to talk about how you can create a sandbox or a dev account and only spend $20 or less, and how you can also make that into a production account and keep that budget under $100. And that might change, but based on specific needs that you might have. But in general, you should be able to create all the basic services at this kind of budget. And you're going to be able to do this without spending credits or before credits. So just imagine later if you can get a hold of some promo codes, then you're running it for free on AWS. So let's get into the plan that I'm going to propose to you. The one is we're going to create an environment, a culture that encourages everybody in your team and everybody that in your staff or your contractors how to save money and architect things in an efficient way. The second thing we're going to talk about is how to create an architecture which gives you opportunity to make a lot of cost-saving opportunities. And then we're going to hit on a few things that you can identify that'll help you save costs. So hi, I'm Angelo Mandato. I'm a software architect. I've done a lot of stuff with AWS since 2007 or 9, if you consider S3 was kind of a little easy to use, but it's kind of led me into a lot of opportunities to take my first startup was Blueberry Podcasting, and we're able to take that to a place where we could scale it when we moved it over to AWS. I've also done a startup with my wife for doing Airbnbs, and my recent startup, which is still in the finding vitality stage, if you're familiar with those kind of terms, is Painless Analytics. And also a little bit about my education background. And I'm also a certified Scrum product owner. And I'm going to incorporate that too into how you can save. So let's talk about your culture. So it's real important to create a culture which encourages everybody that's there to really speak up when they see opportunities to save money or do something different that might be more efficient. So let's talk about a little bit of how you create this cost-saving culture. The first thing I find is to just be transparent, which kind of leads to the second item, which is give your employees, your staff, access to the bill. If they know they're burning through cash and you've created the right culture where they're allowed to speak up, then they're going to tell you, like, hey, does this impact the pizza money for next week? And it does. So let them know. Invest in setting up a schedule where you talk about just costs, maybe once a month, maybe quarterly. I kind of like to do it at first once a week just to set a pattern, and then we can drop it into like once a month. We maybe meet for 5 to 15 minutes just to say, hey, what did we do to save money? What are we doing and it doesn't impact our SLA, things like that. And then you want to involve anybody that needs to be involved, your stakeholders. If you have an investor that's actually going to use your service, they might say, we want this to be high availability, this particular thing. And that changes your path then, how you architect. And encourage feedback. And let me get into a little bit more about how you can get feedback. And you can do things to incentivize your staff. I kind of like the idea of setting up incentives or just giving recognition when it's due. I think that's a perfect way to start a culture. But you can also do bonuses and, how did I word it there? Oh, awards even for different things of how they've saved money or come up with a clever way of making something more efficient. The biggest thing, I think, especially nowadays, is to just explain that when you make changes that lower costs, you're usually also lowering the amount of resources you're using, which really helps the environment. And I think, at least I've found, that really resonates with a lot of the developers that I work with, because they really, think of the environment as a thing that they really need to be responsible for. So it really gets them kind of more engaged. They feel more that they're doing actually something when they make something better. And actually, it seems kind of weird to kind of throw this in, but create a culture of self-awareness. We all make mistakes. We're all going to leave an instance running, like we talked about at the keynote this morning. If you are okay with that and say, hey, this is a learning experience, let's create a procedure or some steps that we can do so we stop repeating that kind of costful mistake, then you're going to get that feedback. If you do the opposite, however, you're going to end up with staff that are afraid to say they left a server on, and it'll stay on for weeks or months because they're afraid of the reaction. So the culture and how you set that tone really needs to be set right away. And just, again, be self-aware, be ready for that kind of feedback so you can kind of work on it. And another way of doing that is to collaborate, make sure you're meeting all the time and talking. And this also helps encourage innovative thinking because, and I'll give an example, when you start thinking about making things more efficient and cost effective, it usually also opens doors for opportunity and productivity. So why do I have sliced bread up here? Does anybody know why? Yeah, oh, perfect. Well, your innovation, your great idea is the next best thing since this, right? So, good segue. How do we architect cost savings then when we're trying to innovate, when we're trying to come up with the next thing since sliced bread? Well, don't overthink cost savings at first. You want to just get that first version out. You want to figure out how it can be made, how it'll work for your customers. You want to launch ASAP. You don't want to be sitting on an idea for months and months and months because you're trying to save all this money on different aspects of scaling and stuff. But this is your opportunity. You're going to start a backlog, and this is where my little Scrum product owner comes out in me. You're going to keep a backlog of every idea that your team has and that you find where you can actually save money. And you're not going to implement these right away. You're going to hold them in, even though like, oh, this would work so much better if we change the auto-scaling group to this or use this operating system or whatever. Don't do it yet. So, when do we start saving money? Then you can probably guess after you've made an innovation. So, until you have a great idea, until you have something that will really get a lot of people excited about your service, don't put the energy into saving money. But put the energy into making that backlog like I talked about. So how do you architect then, without worrying about saving money, but put you on a path where there's lots of opportunity? And that is with a decoupled architecture. And I don't want to sound like a broken record because Amazon's been preaching this since I can remember. But even before Amazon was preaching it, there were professors when I was in college that really talked about how you needed to modularize and separate your pieces. And my professor used the best term, divide and conquer. As soon as you're able to put something in its own silo you can then deal with that faster and easier than if you had one big monolithic app. Some other tips are to use CloudFormation templates, templatizing your infrastructure, which I'll give an example why that helps on saving costs. You're, as much as possible, want to use serverless technology, not for everything, but as much as possible. And then also, you'll want to leverage resources, frameworks that are low cost, easy to implement, and with a few command lines and maybe with some AI, you can build out the framework and everything you need for your application. Oh, and you want to share resources whenever possible. And I'll get into that as an example too. So the question I've had when I talk about this is this slows down development. And I'm here to tell you, maybe the first week, but once you've established how you're going to piece apart your application into smaller silos, it actually is the opposite. So you're going to figure out at this time, when you create your application in its decoupled architecture, also how to deal with scaling, how to deal with disaster recovery, and at the same time, you're going to identify parts that you have to have online 100% of the time for your service level agreement. And I'm more convinced than over the years that you'll be able to innovate faster. And I'll actually touch on that too with my example. So before I jump into that, does anybody have questions? And this guy is really cute, isn't he? Or she? Or Mr. Question? So no questions are good probably, but if you have them, now's a good time to. All right. So how are we going to innovate faster? The decoupled architecture allows us to do a lot of things. We're able to separate the complexity. Hopefully that's pretty obvious because now you can have your front end being React, your back end using serverless API, like API gateway, maybe written in Node or whatnot. You're able to then focus on your innovation. This is key. So if your innovation is using AI and your interaction with the AI is with your serverless application, you focus on that. You shouldn't have to worry too much about the front end, the React part of it, even though you might have a designer working with a React front end developer to do that. Your focus and your resources are going to be dedicated towards that innovation with working with AI, with whatever you're trying to accomplish. You're going to get the flexibility, the maintainability, and a good example why this is easy to maintain is if you just have to update your front end because of a new license agreement or thing you need to put on the copyright, you can do that without building the entire application. You're now just focused on the React piece of it. And you can split out development. So when I was talking about how you can have your React developer work on one thing, they can do that without impacting the rest of the team that's working on the back end, working with your API and your AI technology. So when you architect with the cost in mind, you're going to have low costs whenever possible. Oh, let me grab it. You're going to eliminate idle resources. You don't want things kind of sitting there wasting money, wasting time. You're going to combine things whenever possible, and you're going to architect your lower environments to run with minimal resources. Now, unfortunately with this, you do trade a little bit of dev time for deciding when you're going to implement certain things, but again, I think it's worth it. So let's go to my startup, Painless Analytics, and how I architected it to save money. I got it in 3 silos, basically, with multiple projects under each. The dev environment, the DevOps, all that, I kind of treat as its own thing. And if I had more time, I'd kind of go into details why this works so well. But in a nutshell, when you create your local environment to do development, that's the same as if you were doing it for the DevOps testing. So the things that are real critical with my service, because I'm logging data and then reporting analytics on it, is literally the resources that log and process that data. So those parts, the logging, that has an SLA to it. Right away when I put that in production, that has auto scaling. Everything I need to be able to fail over is there from the get-go. My service side of things, where people sign in, they create an account, that kind of stuff, until I get to a certain point with vitality or with number of customers, I can actually put this on one instance, or I can just use serverless and not really worry about an outage, because if I have an outage, it's 5 minutes. I have a auto scaling group to just replace the instance with another one. It's really cost effective to take that approach, because then you're not wasting money. And for the most part, I have not seen a lot of instances have those kind of issues where you have to take them down and have them replaced anyway. So it's a decent risk to take when you're in that early stage. I also kind of mentioned some of the services and combinations I'm doing. So let's talk about the production versus the dev environment. I kind of touched on a little bit, but the dev environment, I have everything running on one box, a set of serverless functions, one database, and one DynamoDB, RDS database and one DynamoDB table. And the beautiful thing with that is that when it sits idle, it costs less than $20 a month. And I'm not going to have tons of traffic on it. It's just my testers and myself and maybe some people I want them to see. So it can handle the traffic. On the flip side, in my production environment, I've split out what I was talking about. The things that are high available that cannot go down, I have them set up the way you traditionally see a stack. And that does cost more. But I identified, like I said, some of those things that can go down for 5 minutes. And I still have that all like lumped into one instance for low cost. And also, just keep in mind what I was talking about, when you created the architecture where you identify the scaling opportunities. I know when I reach a certain number of customers, it's time to take a couple of these instances, they're all mapped into one, split it out, set up auto scaling groups, or set up containers to make it handle the new traffic. Now, in the DevOps environment, which if I have time later, if you're curious, you can come up to me. I can kind of go into detail how the DevOps environment and setting up a local environment on your computer is just as quick, just as easy to set up. And it's easy to get onboard a developer too. It's kind of one of the extra bonuses to taking this approach. So I wanted to put some facts with the actual claim. This is my bill last month for AWS in my test environment. It's actually under $20. Unfortunately, I left a couple volumes on some testing I was doing last month. So my bill is now over $100, but don't worry, I fixed them. Next month's bill will be back to under 100 again. So we're talking about the mistakes and owning up to them and learning from them. So the local DevOps, this is something I'm kind of proud of. You can do the same thing with containers using Docker on your local computer. I've set up a system where you can use bat scripts or bash scripts and quickly deploy everything on a local computer. Use for Windows, use WAMP server. And then with some trickery with hostname that you use only for local development, you can use Apache to port these different ports to your running services that you run locally and test everything locally. Even DynamoDB, you can run through command line through Java and have it running without using Docker. It really saves a lot of memory and resources on your local computer when you're doing development. But B, again, it's really easy, quick to install everything. I can get a developer up and running with all the scripts in less than 30 minutes. And I know, hey, let's solve a problem, not how do I set this up or how do I get this to work. So some tips. You want to document everything. Documentation and kind of keeping track of all the changes is gold. You want to separate the costs that are important and secondary. So for example, if you have a WordPress site and that's maybe doing documentation, you can change that. You can move that maybe to a free resource at first. There's things you can do to save money there. You want to increment your changes and keep a track of it with the changelog. Review your infrastructure costs on a cadence like I talked about, and only implement things like high availability when it's necessary. So you're at the point now where your company You've saved a lot of money now. You developed something. You're now putting in cost savings in mind. And now you're getting that traction. Your company is taking off. You're starting to get a lot of users or customers, whoever they're called in your industry. So how, while this is happening, do we identify cost-saving opportunities? The first one is what we already talked about. You know, the little product owner comes out, and I've been keeping this backlog of every opportunity that I saw, and I start prioritizing them. So the biggest thing is to look for the small changes you can make that has the biggest impact first. You want to start knocking those out right away. Usually it's something like changing your DNS time to live setting. That's a real easy one that can save some money real quick. The next thing you're going to look at is changes that might take a little more work, but still have a big savings. The last two here, not so much. So if something's is a little change with a little impact, maybe it's worth doing. But the one you really want to avoid is something where you spend 3 weeks to save like $20 on your bill. It's not worth it. Don't go down that rabbit hole. Don't waste the resources or time. So, oh, did I not? Here we go. Now there's two main areas when you're looking at where you can save money on costs. One is the application, the other is architecture. Obviously with AWS, there's lots of opportunities. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about how you can save money with your application. And this is really where a lot of opportunity comes in. And some of this, when you look at your application, it'll change the architecture that you're using. Instead of using instances, regular EC2 instances, you might end up changing to either serverless or Docker containers. You might go the opposite direction because of how you architect things. So I wanted to talk about when I was at the Blueberry podcasting business, and we did a podcast directory, and we pulled podcast feeds, how we made the scripts that downloaded the podcast feeds to look for new episodes more efficient. And actually, I'm proud to say the developer, she's here. So if you want to ask her more details of stuff she did, go find her. Her name is Lena. She's one of the organizers here. But in 4 weeks' time, we went from a typical script where you just looped and pulled podcast feeds to using a library called curl multi, which allowed us to adjust the settings of how many podcast feeds we could pull at the same time. Basically, it's multi-threaded. And then we also used logic that we learned from HTTP headers, using the E-tag, the last modified sense headers. And we got to the point where we were making efficiencies to pull 100,000 feeds. And then a couple of years later, we figured out how to get it even more tweaked to up to 200,000 podcast feeds in an hour. Oh, there she is. Hey, Elena. So a lot of the stuff we did with this led to new features as well. So when we saw podcast feeds were slow, it led us to develop a podcast feed validating service. And then it also opened us the doors to like, hey, we can monitor these feeds and let podcasters know when they're having issues. So we were solving one issue with cost and efficiency, and it opened up more opportunities. So let's talk about then, that's the application. Let's talk about architectural changes you can make. I'm only going to touch on some, but some of the biggest ones I find is like Amazon S3. A lot of people don't know when you create an actual record in S3, or I'm sorry, Route 53. When you create a record in Route 53, there's a way to do it called an alias with an AWS service. If you use a DNS name or an IP address, you end up paying for all the costs for every request that's made for that. It's real simple to change it to an alias record, and then all of a sudden that cost is now eaten by Amazon because that's a service they're providing to you. You can do a bit of thinking when you're doing your architecture, like I did with the analytics, and I have all the requests that go to my auto-scaling group and load balancer use a different host name that customers don't see unless they did like a DNS lookup. But that helped me save costs and bring costs down in that avenue that I now don't have to worry about. S3 regions, I'm sure everybody's here probably has heard of, you don't want to put your application in US East 2 in Ohio, but then use a bucket in Ireland. A, the performance, and B, the cost. So parameter store secrets. This one blew my mind. I actually contracted for a company for a few months and saw that their bill for doing just secret pulling out their secrets in their application was high. So looking at the application, we quickly figured out every time someone was doing a page view or an API call to their Laravel app, it was hitting secrets manager, pulling the secrets, putting them in the variable. A, that was causing the application to be slow, but B, it was also hitting secrets manager, which eventually adds up costs. CloudFront not being optimized, and that's more of an opportunity than anything. A lot of us will just set it up real quick to get the proof of concept going. You have to go back and set up those caching headers. It'll also improve your user's experience as they hit your website at the same time. CloudWatch alarms, I've seen companies where they just put too many of those in place, and they're not necessary. Sometimes they never go off, but you're paying for it. So my case was the volume that was actually used this morning too in the keynote. Load balancers, I've seen companies think that they have to have a load balancer to keep everything together, even though they only have one instance, because they want that instance to be replaced if it goes down. Well, you don't have to. You can literally put CloudFront going directly to your instance, and as long as you're using a elastic IP that stays consistent, you can keep this architecture all together. So there's a few more here, but I want to try to hit this last point. The main goal is you're trying to innovate, you're trying to come up with a company that's doing something new. You need to save this. You need to save money. So with that, there's also opportunity to save more money, which is a plug for Amazon and their program to activate to try to get people to sign up for startups. If you have a bootstrap startup, you can get $1,000 of credit real quick. I think it takes like 2 or 3 days. If you have a bootstrap startup, there's a longer process. I've been told it takes 1 to 2 weeks, but you can get even more credit. I believe that can get up to $100,000 of AWS credit. So if you're trying to build a startup, depending on the approach you're taking, there's a lot of money here that you can get for free credit, I should say. And if you get your bill down, like I was showing in my example, you can go 2 years because they have an opportunity to get more, even if the bootstrapped company, to keep the lights on without spending a dime on AWS. So I wanted to thank everybody. Thanks for coming out. If you want to learn more about what I talked about, I'm going to have slides as well as the video of this up online. And also, I have a more detailed list of different features or different services in AWS where you can save money and costs. So thanks a lot.